On May 8th, news rippled through the camp. Germany had surrendered. The war in Europe was over. Bridget sat at a table in the mess hall and pulled out paper and pencil. This time the words came easier. Leaf's latte, I want you to know the truth about everything. About the propaganda we believed. About the camps our country built. About the lipstick the Americans let me keep and the mercy I didn't deserve but received anyway. But that moment of clarity came only after a journey that began in darkness and terror. 3 months earlier, in August of 1945, Bridget had stood on a ship deck watching the German coastline disappear into gray mist. Her hands pressed against the photograph hidden deep inside her left sock, a small square of paper that held the only thing that mattered anymore. Latte's face, dark braids framing a smile, captured 2 years prior in a world that no longer existed. Around her, 200 women crowded the deck in silence. Some wept quietly. Others stood rigid, faces blank with shock. They were prisoners now, captured auxiliary forces being transported across an ocean to a country none of them had ever seen. America. The word itself felt alien on Bridget's tongue. The propaganda posters had shown American soldiers with exaggerated features, cruel mouths, grasping hands, predatory eyes. Barbarians who knew nothing of civilization, who would treat German prisoners the way they treated everything else, with violence and contempt. Beside her, a younger woman named Ilse leaned close, her sharp features rigid with conviction. Don't show weakness when we arrive. They feed on weakness like dogs. Bridget nodded, but said nothing. The photograph pressed against her ankle like a talisman, a reminder that somewhere across this vast distance, a child still remembered her mother's face. After 2 weeks at sea, the ship's horn sounded low and mournful as land appeared on the horizon. Women stirred, murmured, clutched each other's hands. The August heat hit like a fist when they finally emerged onto American soil. Texas. The word meant nothing to Bridget except distance, an impossible gulf between herself and everything she'd known. Armed guards lined the dock, but their rifles hung loose at their sides. No snarling, no shouting, just young men in olive uniforms watching with expressions Bridget couldn't quite read. Camp Swift sprawled behind chain-link fencing. Rows of wooden barracks painted a pale cream that seemed obscene in its cheerfulness. Real buildings, not muddy trenches or bombed-out ruins. Bridget's throat tightened. This had to be temporary, a holding area before the real punishment began. They were marched through the gates in a silent column. No one spat at them. No one jeered. The Americans simply directed them forward with minimal words, minimal contact. Inside a processing building, women were separated into small groups. Bridget found herself standing before a folding table where an American woman in a Red Cross uniform sat, with a clipboard and a tired expression. The woman looked up. Her face was unremarkable, thin, drawn, dark circles under her eyes, but her gaze was direct. She said something in English that Bridget didn't catch, then switched to German. Careful German, slightly accented, but clear. Name: Müller. Bridget Muller. Her voice came out rougher than she'd intended. The Red Cross woman wrote it down, her nameplate reading Miriam. Date of birth. Bridget answered automatically, her mind elsewhere, focused on keeping the photograph hidden. But when she shifted her weight, the picture slipped just a fraction and tumbled from inside her sock onto the concrete floor. Time slowed. Bridget stared at Latte's face, looking up from the ground, vulnerable and exposed. Her breath stopped. This was it. They'd confiscate it, question her about it, use it against her somehow. Miriam bent down and picked up the photograph. She held it carefully, studying the image of the little girl with dark braids. For a long moment, she said nothing, and Bridget felt her entire body go rigid with dread. Then Miriam looked up, her expression softening in a way Bridget hadn't expected. Your daughter. It wasn't a question. Bridget managed a jerky nod, her throat too tight for words. Miriam held the photograph out to her, returning it without hesitation. Keep it safe. Bridget took it with shaking hands, unable to process what had just happened. The propaganda had promised confiscation of all personal items, especially anything that might provide comfort or connection to home. Yet here was this American woman, this enemy, returning the one thing that mattered most. "She is beautiful," Miriam added quietly before turning back to her paperwork. Next question. The barracks assignment came that same afternoon. Bridget followed a guard down a dirt path between rows of wooden structures painted a pale cream color that seemed absurdly cheerful given the circumstances. Inside, she found real beds, not cots thrown on muddy ground, not bombed ruins with blankets over rubble, but actual metal frame beds with thin mattresses and folded wool blankets at the foot of each one. The mess hall that evening revealed another impossible truth. Actual food portions. Potatoes, beans, bread that wasn't moldy or mixed with sawdust. Women moved through the line in stunned silence, taking trays as if they might vanish at any moment. Bridget sat at a long wooden table and forced herself to eat slowly, though her stomach screamed for more after years of rationing and deprivation. It was the next morning when the real shock came. A Red Cross worker moved through the barracks carrying a box of personal items. Soap, combs, small mirrors. And then, impossibly, cosmetics. A woman 2 beds down received a small tube of lipstick, coral-colored and absurdly ordinary. She stared at it like it might explode in her hands. Ilsa appeared at Bridget's elbow, her voice low and sharp. "This is a trick. They want us comfortable before the real punishment begins. Or worse, they want us to forget we're German, forget our loyalty to the fatherland." Accepting their gifts means betraying every soldier who died. Several women nodded in agreement, their faces hard with determination. But others reached for the items when offered, hands trembling as they touched something that represented normalcy, femininity, dignity beyond the designation of prisoner. When the Red Cross worker reached Bridget's bunk, she held out a small lipstick tube in a shade of soft rose. Bridget's hand moved without conscious thought, accepting the weight of it in her palm. Such a small thing, such an enormous symbol. It meant they still saw her as a woman, as a person who might want to feel human again. That night, Bridget lay in the darkness listening to muffled crying from Ilsa's corner and whispered conversations that never quite stopped. The lipstick sat in her locker beside the photograph, and she understood suddenly what it had become. Not just color for lips, but proof they were still women, still mothers and daughters and teachers. Still people who deserved to exist beyond the roles war had forced upon them. Over the following weeks, Bridget found herself watching Miriam work with the other prisoners. The Red Cross worker moved through the camp with steady professionalism. Her careful German never rushed, never condescending. There was something in her manner that spoke of exhaustion carried quietly. Dark circles under her eyes suggesting burdens beyond the daily tasks of managing prisoner welfare. Small moments accumulated into something Bridget couldn't quite name. Miriam explaining camp procedures without impatience. Miriam listening to a woman's tearful request to send a letter home and promising to see what could be done. Miriam handing out medical supplies with the same care whether the prisoner was cooperative or hostile. Eventually, Bridget began helping with administrative tasks, organizing supply lists, translating announcements, filing paperwork in the camp office. It meant working near Miriam's desk, close enough to observe but not so close as to intrude. Their conversations remained carefully neutral. Comments about the weather, questions about routine matters, brief exchanges that built a foundation of something fragile. "How long have you worked here?" Bridget asked one afternoon while sorting forms. "Since the camp opened last spring," Miriam replied without looking up from her ledger. "Before that, I was at a facility in New Mexico. The work must be difficult." Miriam's pencil paused for just a moment before continuing its steady notation. "All work during wartime is difficult, but someone has to do it." Bridget noticed how Miriam's hands sometimes trembled slightly when processing new arrivals, how her jaw tightened when prisoners spoke of losses back home. Whatever burdens this American woman carried, they ran deeper than simple fatigue from long hours. Trust grew incrementally, built on the foundation of repeated interactions that contained no cruelty, no mockery, no violence. Each day that passed without the promised American brutality chipped away at the propaganda that had shaped Bridget's expectations. Miriam never raised her voice, never struck anyone, never used her authority as a weapon. One evening, as Bridget finished organizing a stack of Red Cross parcels, Miriam spoke quietly without preamble. "You were a teacher before the war." It wasn't a question. Bridget froze, then nodded slowly. "I thought so," Miriam said, her expression unreadable. "You have that way about you. Patient, careful with words." Bridget didn't know how to respond, so she simply returned to her task, while something unnamed passed between them in the silence. The division among the prisoners deepened as autumn approached. Some women, like Ilsa, maintained rigid resistance to any comfort the Americans offered. They refused the cosmetics, ate only what was necessary for survival, and spoke constantly of loyalty to the fatherland and the soldiers who had died fighting. Others, including Bridget, found themselves accepting small dignities as they came, not out of disloyalty, but out of bone-deep exhaustion that made the prospect of maintaining constant hostility feel impossible. They were still prisoners, still separated from everything they'd known, still uncertain of their futures. But they were also still human, still women who had once cared about such ordinary things as clean hair and smooth skin. In the washroom one morning, Bridget watched several women gathered around a cracked mirror someone had propped against the wall. They took turns applying the lipstick and powder they'd been given, studying their reflections with expressions that mixed hope and guilt. One woman touched her colored lips and began to cry, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming strangeness of feeling like a person again instead of just a designation, a category, a problem to be managed. Ilsa appeared in the doorway, her voice cutting through the quiet moment. "You look like whores preening for your captors. Have you forgotten what they've done to our country? Have you forgotten every man who died defending the Reich?" The women at the mirror flinched but didn't respond. What could they say? That maintaining femininity felt like a form of survival. That remembering they were once mothers and daughters and clerks and teachers mattered in ways that transcended politics and war. Bridget found herself caught between these camps, understanding both positions without fully belonging to either. She used the lipstick Miriam had given her, but felt a twist of shame each time. She maintained her appearance, but wondered if doing so meant betraying something essential. Memory came in fragments during those weeks, teaching her students about German superiority and the righteousness of the war effort, sending latte to youth meetings because that's what good German mothers did, believing the propaganda about subhuman enemies and the necessity of expansion. She'd taught children to hate, taught them to accept lies as truth. The contrast between those memories and her current reality created a dissonance Bridget couldn't resolve. How could the barbaric Americans of propaganda be the same people who let her keep her daughter's photograph, who provided beds and food and dignity? March arrived with wildflowers blooming along the camp fence, small bursts of yellow and purple that seemed inappropriate in their cheerfulness. Bridget was folding laundry in the washroom when Miriam appeared in the doorway, holding an envelope with international postage and Swiss stamps. "For you," Miriam said quietly, extending it toward her. Bridget's hands began to shake so violently she almost couldn't take it. Her fingers fumbled with the paper, tearing slightly at the edge in her haste. Inside was a single page covered in her mother's careful script, the handwriting achingly familiar. And folded within that, a piece of newsprint with crayon marks. She unfolded it with trembling fingers. A drawing. Simple shapes in primary colors. A woman with dark hair and a smile, standing in front of a house with a red roof. Underneath, in a child's uncertain letters that wandered across the page, the words mean Mutti von Latte. The washroom tilted. Bridget pressed the drawing to her chest and felt something break open inside her, something she'd kept locked and frozen for months. The tears came in great heaving sobs that shook her entire body. Years of held grief and terror and desperate hope pouring out in waves she couldn't control. Miriam stood beside her, not speaking, not touching, just present. When Bridget finally looked up through blurred vision, she saw tears on Miriam's face too. Different grief, different loss, but grief nonetheless. Something in that shared moment of pain transcended the roles they occupied, prisoner and guard, German and American, defeated and victor. "She remembers you," Miriam said softly, her voice thick with emotion. Bridget nodded, unable to form words. Her throat felt too tight, too raw. She looked down at the drawing again, at the crooked house and the smiling figure that represented her in her daughter's mind. Lotte was 7 now. 2 years since they'd last seen each other. 2 years of a child's life spent without her mother. And yet she'd drawn this. She'd remembered. For the first time since her capture, Bridget felt something beyond mere survival. She felt hope, fragile and terrifying and utterly real. Somewhere across an ocean, a little girl with dark braids still knew she had a mother, still believed that mother would return. April arrived with an announcement that drained the color from every face in the compound. Mandatory assembly in the mess hall. All prisoners required to attend. No exceptions. The camp commander's expression was granite as guards posted notices on every barracks door. Rumors spread through whispers and worried glances. Some said they were being transferred to different facilities. Others feared deportation back to the ruins of Germany. Ilsa insisted it was finally the punishment everyone had been waiting for, that the Americans had grown tired of pretending civility. But when Colonel Hayes stood before them in the mess hall that afternoon, his words carried a weight that silenced every speculation. "You'll be shown footage," he said, his voice level but heavy. "Footage of what Allied forces discovered when they liberated the camps in Europe. We believe you should know what was done." Bridget's stomach churned with dread. She'd heard whispers over the months, rumors that filtered through even the most censored news. Labor camps, concentration camps, places where enemies of the Reich had been sent. But propaganda had always dismissed such talk as exaggeration, as Allied lies designed to justify their own atrocities and demonize Germany. The lights dimmed. The projector whirred to life, casting a pale square on the white wall at the front of the room. The first images were of gates. Iron gates with words worked into the metal. Arbeit macht free. Work sets you free. Greta recognized the phrase from 100 Nazi posters, 100 speeches about the dignity of labor and the purification of the state. Then the camera moved inside. The room went absolutely silent. Not the silence of attention, but the silence of breath stopping, of minds refusing to process what eyes were seeing. Beside Bridget, a woman made a small, choking sound. Another began to whimper quietly. Many sat frozen, faces slack with an emotion beyond mere shock. Bridget couldn't look away. The screen held horrors that seemed impossible, that violated everything she'd understood about the world, about her country, about the righteous cause she believed in and taught others to believe in. Her hands gripped the edge of the table so hard her knuckles turned white. But she couldn't move, couldn't close her eyes, couldn't escape the truth unfolding in black and white images that burned themselves into her mind forever. Bodies, piles of them, skeletal and naked, stacked like cordwood. Living people who looked like corpses, eyes huge and skulls covered with paper-thin skin. Children with distended bellies and hollow faces staring at the camera with expressions beyond human comprehension. Ovens, train cars packed with the dead. Mass graves being bulldozed open, revealing layers upon layers of tangled limbs and empty faces. Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, Buchenwald. The narrator's voice was clinical, professional, listing numbers that seemed impossible. Thousands, tens of thousands, mountains of shoes, mountains of eyeglasses, mountains of human hair. The camera showed Allied soldiers weeping as they tried to help survivors too weak to stand, too far gone to save. It showed medical experiments, torture devices, gas chambers disguised as showers. It showed German civilians from nearby towns being marched through the camps at gunpoint, forced to witness what had been done in their names, what had happened in facilities some of them could see from their windows. The room had become a chorus of horror. Someone was retching in the corner. Someone else sobbed openly, gasping for air between cries. Many sat in frozen silence, faces blank with shock so profound it rendered them motionless. A voice whispered desperately that it had to be Allied propaganda, that it was staged, that it couldn't be real. But Bridget couldn't look away from the screen, couldn't unsee the children's faces, the mountains of belongings stripped from the dead, the survivors with numbers tattooed on their arms. She knew, with the same certainty she'd known when Miriam had returned her photograph, that this was real. This had happened. Her country had done this. The lipstick in her pocket felt obscene. The bed she slept in, the food she ate, the small dignity she'd been granted, all of it felt like a mockery. How could she accept mercy, dignity, small kindnesses when her nation had built factories of death? When she believed the lies, taught them to her students, sent her own daughter to youth meetings because that's what good German mothers did. The footage continued relentlessly. More camps, more bodies, more evidence of systematic murder on a scale that defied comprehension. The narrator explained the logistics, the bureaucracy, the industrial efficiency of genocide. The lights came back on. No one moved. The projector continued to whir emptily, the reel spinning out, but the images were already burned permanently into every mind in that room. Colonel Hayes spoke again, his voice heavy with something that sounded almost like exhaustion. This is what we fought against. This is why we thought you should know. Bridget stumbled outside into the bright Texas afternoon. The sunlight seemed wrong, too cheerful, too ordinary for a world where such things existed. The sky was impossibly blue. A breeze carried the scent of wildflowers. Everything looked exactly as it had that morning, but nothing would ever be the same. Around her, women scattered in all directions. Some ran toward the barracks as if they could escape what they'd seen. Others collapsed on benches, unable to make their legs carry them any farther. The sound of weeping came from every corner of the compound, not the quiet crying of homesickness or fear, but something rawer, more broken. Ilsa stood near the fence, both hands gripping the chain link so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Her whole body convulsed with sobs that seemed to tear themselves from somewhere deep inside her chest. Not the angry sobs of resistance, but the kind that came from a worldview shattering into pieces too small to ever reassemble. Her rigid certainty, her fierce loyalty, her insistence on maintaining German pride, all of it had been built on lies that could no longer be denied. Bridget found herself at the edge of the compound, staring at nothing. The wildflowers swayed in the breeze, their small faces turned toward the sun. In the distance, a mockingbird sang its complicated song. The world kept turning as if nothing had changed, as if the revelation of industrialized murder on an incomprehensible scale was just another event in history's long march forward. But everything had changed. Everything. Bridget thought of her classroom, of the maps on the wall showing Germany's rightful expansion. She thought of the textbooks that explained racial purity in Lebensraum. She thought of leading children in songs about the fatherland's glory. She thought of Latte in her youth uniform, learning the same lies. What had she done? What had they all done? How many people had believed because teachers like her had taught them to believe? How many had participated because propaganda had convinced them it was necessary? Righteous good? Miriam appeared at Bridget's side in silence. For long minutes, neither woman spoke. They simply stood together at the edge of the compound, two people separated by everything that mattered in wartime, nationality and victor status, and the vast gulf of suffering, yet connected by something that transcended all of it. Shared humanity. Shared grief. Finally, Miriam's voice came, quiet and wrecked. My grandmother. My cousins. Bergen-Belsen. She stopped, swallowed hard, her throat working against words that didn't want to come. My parents escaped in '38. They brought me here when I was 13. I found out last week the others didn't make it. Bridget turned to look at her. Miriam's face was wet with tears, but her expression was somehow steady underneath the grief, as if she'd already walked through this valley of horror and emerged on the other side, still standing, still breathing, still choosing to show up each day. Greta's voice cracked when she finally spoke. How do you? She couldn't finish the question. How do you show us mercy? How do you treat us like humans? How do you bear it? How do you hand me lipstick and return my daughter's photograph when my country murdered your family? How do you stand here beside me instead of spitting in my face? Miriam was quiet for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the distant horizon. Different sides, same grief. The words settled between them like a benediction, like an accusation, like a truth too complicated for simple categories of victim and perpetrator, innocent and guilty. Bridget felt the weight of everything pressing down on her chest until she could barely breathe. I taught them, she whispered. I stood in front of children and taught them the propaganda. I told them we were superior. I told them expansion was necessary. I sent latte to youth meetings because that's what good German mothers did. The lipstick in her pocket felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. How could she accept mercy, accept dignity, accept the smallest kindness when her nation had built factories of death? When she'd been complicit, not through direct action, but through belief, through teaching, through participation in the machinery that made such horrors possible. I didn't know, she said desperately. We didn't know. But even as the words left her mouth, she knew they weren't quite true. There had been whispers. There had been neighbors who'd disappeared. There had been signs she'd chosen not to see because seeing would have required questioning everything. Miriam's response came slowly, each word chosen with care. I don't know how to bear it. I wake up every morning and it's still true. They're still gone. The camp still existed. The machinery of murder still functioned with bureaucratic efficiency. She paused, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. But I know that mercy matters. That breaking cycles of hatred requires someone choosing a different path. That treating you with dignity doesn't erase what happened, doesn't absolve anyone, but maybe it means something for what comes next. Bridget stood beside her, beginning to understand something profound and terrible. Mercy was not absolution. It was not forgiveness for the unforgivable. It was a gift that demanded responsibility, that required carrying both the weight of what had been received and the burden of what had been done. They sat together on a bench as the afternoon light lengthened into evening, two women from opposite sides of an unfathomable horror, sharing grief that had different origins but the same human pain. Around them, the compound continued its processing of truth. Some women maintained desperate denial, insisting the footage was fabricated. Others broke completely, unable to function under the weight of revelation. And some, like Bridget, entered a painful acceptance that offered no comfort, only the terrible clarity of understanding. Night fell with continued weeping and whispered conversations that would stretch through darkness and into dawn. Women held each other, strangers bound by shared nationality and shared shame. They spoke of family members who might have participated, of signs they'd ignored, of choices they'd made or failed to make. In her bunk, Bridget held Latte's drawing, studying the simple crayon lines and the crooked letters spelling out love from a child to a mother. The weight of what she had to teach her daughter felt crushing. The truth about propaganda believed. The truth about camps their country built. The truth about mercy received that didn't erase guilt but existed alongside it. She understood now that she was both victim and perpetrator. Victim of a propaganda machine that had shaped her beliefs from childhood. Perpetrator through her participation in spreading those beliefs to others. Both things could be true simultaneously. Both things were true. The transformation happening inside her wasn't about redemption from guilt. There was no redemption for what had been done. But there was perhaps a path forward that involved accepting both the mercy shown and the responsibility to carry truth into whatever future remained. On May 8th, news rippled through the camp. Germany had surrendered. The war in Europe was over. Bridget sat at a table in the mess hall and pulled out paper and pencil. This time the words came easier. Leaps latte, I want you to know the truth about everything. About the propaganda we believed. About the camps our country built. About the lipstick the Americans let me keep and the mercy I didn't deserve but received anyway. Her hand moved steadily across the page, no longer shaking with the uncertainty that had plagued her earlier attempts to write. She told her daughter about arriving in Texas, expecting brutality, and finding dignity instead. About the photograph returned when it could have been confiscated. about the small tube of rose-colored lipstick that represented something larger than cosmetics. I want you to grow up knowing that mercy is real even when cruelty is too, she wrote. That small kindnesses matter, especially when everything else is broken. That we must carry the truth of what happened, not to torture ourselves with endless guilt, but to ensure it never happens again. She explained about the newsreels, about the camps with names that would haunt history forever. She didn't spare her daughter the truth, but she didn't burden her with details no child should carry. She wrote about responsibility, about how believing lies didn't excuse spreading them, about how being a victim of propaganda didn't erase participation in its machinery. And she wrote about Miriam, about a woman who had every reason to hate and chose mercy instead, about how that choice didn't erase the past, but perhaps offered a path toward a different future. That's what I learned here, Bridget wrote, the final sentences forming with careful deliberation. That transformation doesn't mean redemption from guilt. It means carrying both the mercy received and the responsibility to remember. It means teaching you to see clearly, to question always, to choose kindness even when hatred seems justified. She sealed the letter and sat holding it for a long moment. Around her, other women processed the news of surrender in their own ways. Some wept with relief. Others sat in stunned silence. The war was over, but its consequences would echo for generations. Bridget's face showed pain and hope coexisting, grief and determination intertwined. She was not redeemed. She was not absolved, but she was committed to carrying truth forward, to breaking cycles, to ensuring her daughter grew up in a world that remembered what happened when people stopped thinking and started believing.